Welcome back to the Wenke Podcast, and today we're doing a solo ep on population collapse. A lovely topic up for the discussion. But what's interesting about this topic is that it's one that does not garner the level of attention that it is due. And why I think that is one, because it's quite counterintuitive. In a sense, is that we've had a growing population for as long as we can remember. And if anything, we've heard the opposite message from mainstream sources. And this primarily started in the late 1960s with a book called The Population Bomb by Paul Ehrlich, I suppose. And Ehrlich, he wrote this book, and essentially he posited that we would overpopulate the earth and ultimately be unable to feed that growing population and have mass starvation. And what is rather ironic about his proclamation is that he was exactly wrong. And it's impressive when someone is exactly wrong at something. That always is rather interesting, because normally people are just somewhat wrong, or you ignore certain levels of complexity. But he actually made an opposite prediction of what we are currently facing. And another interesting note about Ehrlich before I leave him is that he's still being trounced around, let's say, as some wise oracle on political issues, on cultural issues, on issues such as this. And given his complete failure in the predictive realm, that seems rather confusing. To put it mildly, as to why he's still being seen as this figure of wisdom. But we're going to move on from him. But nonetheless, he posited this claim, and for a long time, that actually seemed relatively reasonable. But what's interesting is that if you look at the data, even when he first published this book, you find out very quickly that he was incorrect and that the trends were in fact reversing. And back to this overall issue, why is this an issue that doesn't grip people in the way that climate change does, or nuclear warfare does? And I think it's because it's something that is a slow burn. There's no obvious immediate risk factors. This is something that over time slowly evolves into a problem. There's no smoke in the sky. There's no immediate existential threat. And yet, from a certain perspective, this is one of our greatest existential threats. And it's certainly, in my opinion, one of the top ones that we don't talk about. Nuclear war may be up there, but this one is even talked about less than nuclear war. But I wanted to bring it up today partially because of that lack of discussion surrounding this issue. And it's relatively complex. So this is not something that is as simple as, people aren't having children, therefore the population is declining. In some sense, that's what's happening. But the reasons as to why, birth replacement rates, where it's happening, what the trends are, what the projections are, all of that's very complicated, and there's a lot of things to be said about it. So let's start with an overview of the topic and kind of where we're at. So typically this term called birth replacement rate is the common one that you'll hear. And what the number that sits at is about 2.1 children per woman, essentially. And the reason that's 2.1 is instead of 2, for instance, is because there's a variety of different factors in terms of age, mortality, differing rates, different numbers of males and females in the population at the time. But that number sits about 2.1. And Chris Williamson brought up this comparison between the R0 value that at least a large majority of people understood during COVID and this birth replacement rate value. And the way that you understand the R0 is that if you have an R0 that's below 1, the virus and infections will continue to decline precipitously. versus if you have an R naught above 1, they will continue to rise. And in this case, the R naught is about 2.1. But what's useful to know is that the further away that you get from that 2.1, the larger effect, or I guess the greater the implications of that value. So the difference between 1.9 and 1.8 is a greater difference than the difference between 1.9 and 2.0. And that's very relevant because we are rapidly approaching a situation where the majority of the world is below birth replacement rate. And in fact, we are there. So as of right now, around 70% of countries are below birth replacement rate. The large exception to this in terms of a group of countries or a geographical region is sub-Saharan Africa. However, even their birth rates are declining relatively quickly. For reference, the birth rate in South Korea is about 0.8. That's a particularly, let's say, extreme case. Japan has also been the typical use case for this phenomenon. They have a rapidly declining population. Right now they're sitting at about 120 million, I believe, and that is declining precipitously. A lot of these numbers, for reference, are coming from a conversation between, well, two different conversations with the same person. Chris Williamson had on Stephen J. Shaw, who is a data analyst, data scientist, who studies specifically this data. And he has a documentary that just came out called Birth Gap, which analyzes what is going on here. He also sat down with Jordan Peterson, and I found both of their conversations very useful. I actually knew, not as if I'm some, wise person for knowing this. I just follow the right people that mentioned this to me. But I actually kind of knew about this issue several years ago, before I would say it became slightly more mainstream, although even now it's not that mainstream. But I've certainly seen more articles in mainstream sources about this issue. But after hearing his statistical analysis of what exactly is going on here, my perspective became a lot more drastic. I was unaware of the degree to which the severity of this issue has progressed. And it's not good, to put it mildly. So let's get into some of the numbers here, shall we? South Korea sits around 0.8. According to one projection by another researcher named Peter Zion, by 2050, China's population will decline to around 600 million people. And for reference, I believe China's population is about 1.5 billion. But I will find that out right now. Yep, 1.42 billion. Oh, the advantages of Google. So I mean that's a massive decline. That's like what, 80%, something like that, decline, roughly speaking. And part of that is been accelerated by China's one-child policy, which has some other interesting implications, because one of the things that happened during that one-child policy is that there were a mass number of abortions for women, because it turns out that for a long time, having a man to work on the farm and carry on the family name was seen as more advantageous than having a woman. And when you can only have one kid, or two, choosing to have more men than women made a lot of sense in the short term. Now one of the things that's happening for China is there's millions of single young men that effectively have no prospect of finding a wife, because the pool of men and the pool of women is simply not commensurate. And that's one of the reasons that there's a large number of essentially wives that are, I don't know if you could categorize them as sex slaves necessarily, but wives that are brought over from other countries, including North Korea and even South Korea, to be essentially sold to young men in China as wives, because they have essentially no chance of actually finding a wife. And that's a massive issue just for China. But again, back to this broad statistic, about 70% of the countries in the world are already below this birth replacement rate. In the Western world, US, Canada, the UK, we're talking about ranges between 1.6 and 1.7. Canada's about 1.5. The only ones that are truly having accelerating populations are sub-Saharan African countries such as Nigeria, Ethiopia, Malawi, if I said that right. So that's a crazy number. I did not realize that the number was 70% of the world's countries. And this has some rather troubling implications. And I want to get into some of them, but first I want to talk a little bit about the statistics behind this. And one thing that if you spend a certain amount of time in statistics, you recognize that the term average actually isn't that useful of a metric. It doesn't necessarily show you what's truly going on. It has its uses, don't get me wrong, but this is a point that Shaw made, which was that he actually did a deep analysis into this average statistic, and he wanted to know, where is this coming from? Because what he found was that, and this is fascinating, he found that the average number of children being born per woman was actually about the same, which was confusing to him because he's like, well, how are we having declining populations with birth rates being around the same per woman? And what he found, that it wasn't the birth rates, it was motherlessness. It was the fact that more and more women elected to not have children as a percentage of the population. So he used the use case of Japan, I believe, and I believe the numbers were something like they jumped from 6% of women not having children in 1 year to, I think it was within 5 to 10 years, the numbers went from 6% to about 30% of women were electing not to have children. But again, he found that the ones that did, mothers still had about the same number of children. So what this means is that the problem isn't individual mothers not having enough children. The problem is women simply electing to not have children. And I want to take a step back here and just make this very clear. This is not me advocating for the Handmaid's Tale. This is not me advocating to force women to have as many kids as possible. This is certainly not the point here. This is a complicated problem, and I think women should have the right to choose whether they want to have kids or not. That's not the point. The point is to analyze the very real problem that this is gonna create. So I found that point that he made about the statistical analysis of the average really, really interesting. And I thought that was fascinating because it identifies the true problem, which is motherlessness. And then you might ask the question, how does that happen? And let's unpack that a little bit, shall we? So what another professor named Professor Rinsk Kaiser, hopefully I pronounced that right, basically what he found is that 80% of women who are childless are so due to life circumstances, such as not having the right partner at the right time, or waiting too long to have children. And this study specifically identified about 10% of women who actually could not medically have children, and another 10% who chose to not have children. And what's fascinating about this is that 80% number, when you do broad-based statistical analysis of like, okay, you ask people like, do you want to have children, just on a broad level, and the 95% of respondents over time, and this has remained relatively steady, it's declined somewhat in the recent years, is yes. So 95% of people want to have children, and yet 80% of women do not have children, not because they chose in some sense to not, but due to life circumstances, meaning that they wanted to have kids but could not have kids. And that's a very different claim than they just didn't want to have kids. And well, how could this happen, right? You might ask the question, how does this happen? And one of the more terrifying statistics that I've run across in this analysis of birth rates and population collapse is that by the age of 30, women have a 50% chance of having kids. 50%. That is a insane statistic. And I ran across this when doing this analysis and looking at the numbers provided by Stephen Shaw, and I was just astounded by that. And some of the reasons why that happens is, one of the basic ones is fertility reasons, that women's fertility declines precipitously as they get older. I've heard different numbers in terms of peak fertility. I've heard 18 to 21 is peak fertility, but I've been, when I researched that, I was somewhat inconclusive, but around then. So the point is, at 30, it's certainly been declining. Another interesting point that was made was that we tend to, Shaw actually interviewed in a raw form fertility doctors. So he actually took them aside and he took them out of an environment where they're essentially trying to sell their services, which you don't blame them for. But what did they do? They try to provide a couple or an individual that's trying to have a kid, generally a couple, with the best possible medical care and as much of a positive outlook as they possibly can. But what Shaw found when he would actually get them one-on-one away from the client and he could actually interview them was that they had a far more dismal perspective about IVF, about these interventions to try to help fertility be increased. And it was fascinating to hear that so many of them recognized how ineffective some of the treatments were in terms of IVF and these other fertility treatments, and how absolutely hard that process was for these mothers these women that desperately wanted to be mothers but could not. And the years and the tens of thousands of dollars spent on fertility interventions that simply didn't work. And it was a rather sobering thing to hear about some of these mothers that tried so desperately to have a family but could not. And back to that 80% statistic, so many of them desperately wanted to have that and yet could not, which again asks this questions of why is this happening. And this brings us to another interesting issue, which is the mass education of women. And I say issue, and I don't mean it's an issue. I mean that it's the broad topic is an issue. The overarching concept is the issue at hand, let's say. But ever since we started educating women, this trend has continued, and it's not a case to not educate women. Let's not take Nate's words incorrectly here. I'm all for educating women. In fact, they seem to be rather good in the corporate world, and are frankly kicking the crap out of a lot of men. This is another interesting statistic that I came across the other day, that women, I believe it's between the ages of 25 and 35 that are in cities, major cities, are making on average about 10% more than men in the same roles, within the same demographics, and within the same age. And that's fascinating because it goes against the overarching narrative that women earn, what's the lovely number, 82 cents on the dollar for men or something, which, if it were true, I would be one of the richer men in the world, because I would just hire all women. I mean, increase my profit margins by 20%. Are you kidding me? I mean, every corporation would do that in a heartbeat, because it turns out that greed incentives are much greater than prejudice against women. But that statistic's been thoroughly debunked, so I don't need to do that here. You can go look into that one. So that's fascinating. These women seem to be doing quite well in the corporate and economic world, shall we say, and more power to them as far as I'm concerned. But one of the consequences of education is that it delays families. And that's not necessarily bad. It can be bad, though, with the data that I'm presenting, which is about fertility, which is about that there is this narrow window that women can successfully actually have kids. And as you continue to push that window out, not only do complications go up, but the probability of success in terms of having a natural child goes way down. So education is a big factor here, where women are simply working on careers, working on education in a way that they just didn't do in the past. And that's delaying, well, A, marriage, and then B, actually having kids. And what Shaw found is so many of these women, they wanted to have kids, but it just never felt like the right time, or they couldn't find the right partner. And by the time that they were able to be, or at least they perceived that they were able to be in a life circumstance that would enable them to have kids, it was too late. And that's very sad. And within the broader context of the issue, that's actually a serious problem from a pure population perspective. So there's a couple of questions about what you do about it, and I want to get to that a little bit later in the podcast, because another note here is I think this will end up being one of two. I believe I'm going to revisit this issue, which I'm sure I will eventually as well, but I think I'm going to do another one on this specific issue, but we'll see. We'll see. This is a rather spontaneous thing, this whole podcast thing. I want to talk a little bit about... here's something relevant. So we actually don't have any examples of countries that have the declining birth rates that we have, that were able to successfully reverse these trends. So from all the data we have going back several centuries, we have never seen nations reverse the trends in birth rates that are occurring right now. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't do it. But another factor here that's relevant to note is this slow creep, this gradual progression or regression in births is something that is slow enough that you don't actually end up seeing the effects of something like this until it's A, too late, and then B, much further down the road. So, and one interesting thing also about age and how long people live and statistics surrounding population is that you're actually able to project into the future with a high degree of accuracy what, like, the actual population is going to be in 100 years, in 50 years. Because it's based upon the people that are alive today. And because we know that all the births that happened in the last 20 years, those people, with the statistical analysis that we have about deaths and mortality rates, etc., we know they're going to be around in about 60 years. And we actually know that number, which is a unique difference between a lot of predictive statistics and population statistics, where our ability to actually predict the future is relatively robust. So we're able to actually see what these trends mean and at what point we go under birth replacement rate, which is fascinating. So one of the implications that I want to talk about was... Okay, let's do this first. So one of the... We'll do the tall girl problem first. And this is a term coined by Chris Williamson, so I give him credit for this, and I find this funny. And the basic idea is that a girl that's 6'1" has a very limited pool of men to potentially date and then ultimately marry, hypothetically, that are actually taller than she is. And this problem is... You can see further examples of this problem within current let's say, the current dating market as a whole. And you can look at women's, essentially their, what would you call it? Who they want to marry, or their proclivities. And their proclivities essentially are, women tend to date up and across competence hierarchies in society. So they typically want a partner that is at least at their level of education, intelligence, conscientious level, etc., or higher. And what's happening is, in the universities, for example, right now women are massively outpacing men in terms of university graduates. So I believe the overall statistic is about to hit 60% of graduates from university are women, and 40% are men. And that is continued to accelerate. More and more women are graduating college, and less men are, which is another discussion, I suppose. But one of the consequences of this is that the pool of, let's say, eligible men for these high-status women has progressively shrunk. And, well, what do you do about that? That's an interesting problem. And Chris Williamson, this is kind of one of his, I would say it's one of his main areas of focus. And if you're interested in the implications of this, statistics surrounding dating, marriage, etc., he has a number of fantastic podcasts on it, and highly recommend it. Highly recommend his stuff. So that's an interesting side to this. Let's go to another place real quick. Back to kind of one of the reasons why women and men, of course, families or couples rather, report not wanting to have children. Is this idea that they would be bringing their children into a rather dark world. And I'm sympathetic to this perspective to a certain degree, because I'm, let's say, well attuned to the suffering in this world. It's been, let's say, a personal issue of mine, not necessarily my own individual suffering, but more the broader issue at hand, the curse of consciousness, as I call it, the fact that we are aware, and we're aware that we suffer, and we have this ability to inflict suffering on other people, which could be posited as the term evil. And this reality of existence is a harsh one. And in recent years, the answer to, let's say, why women don't want to have kids is because bringing them into this world would be a disservice to them. How could we do that? And again, while I have sympathy for this perspective, from most metrics, it's completely backwards. So, from most metrics, especially economic ones, this is completely incorrect. We live in the most prosperous time in the history of humanity by a margin that's incalculable. Most people 100 years ago had to sleep with their animals to stay warm at night. So the level of wealth that we have today is so unparalleled that the claim that we aren't economically well off enough to support a family is missing the point, at least, or at least it lacks proper context. And I want to be clear that that doesn't mean that I'm not aware that the costs of goods, the costs of living, in some ways have gone up. In other ways, they haven't. But the standard of living has also progressively risen as well. And I think people underestimate that fact, that standard of living has increased along with the cost of things. And it's brought us into a unique position where economically things are tough to have children, but comparing that to, the early 1900s, it's simply a no-brainer between the economic situation on the ground then versus now. So I think that excuse, I don't even want to call it an excuse, that level of reasoning or that line of reasoning rather, as to why to not bring children into the world, I just don't think upon deeper analysis it holds weight. I really don't. And perhaps that's naive, but I'm at least trying to orientate us towards a positive outlook here, which I'll get to the positive, don't you worry. Although that may be episode 2, because that also is rather complicated. Okay, something I want to touch on was this economic issue. And this is really important because our entire society is predicated on an increasingly larger number of young people, growing populations, growing GDP, growing everything, profit margins increasing, economics, expansion, etc., etc., etc. And yet we're entering into a time where that equation could reasonably flip, especially from a population standpoint, where the share of young people to old people, and that as a fraction, is going to continue to flip. And I like to use the example of Social Security, because I think that this kind of highlights one way in which our economic system is predicated on this concept of an increasingly large pool of young people, and how this is no longer going to be the case. So when Social Security was first established in 1935, and there was approximately 42 workers paying into the program for every one person receiving benefits. That ratio in 2021 is 2.8. And one of the implications of this is that the system is completely bankrupt. The money doesn't exist. There's not some vault. The government simply prints the money that goes into Social Security paychecks. And that ratio of 2.8, which was at 1.42, is going to continue to get worse. So the ratio of young people paying into the system will continue to decline. And the ratio of people taking out, or I guess the number of people taking out, will continue to increase. And there's a number of different reasons for that, some of which are perfectly reasonable and good, such as the fact that people are living longer. But what came with that is that average life expectancy when the program first came around in 1935 was 61 years, and retirement age was 65. Well, today average life expectancy is 82, I believe, something like that. But our retirement age is still 65. So we're living longer, but we're retiring at the same time. Well, when you have a economic program like Social Security that was really only meant to help out a small minority of people that had no resources from family and that planned really poorly for retirement, that happened to live past the age of 61, that system has been completely burned by the current reality. And yet, not to get into Social Security too much here because it's just a nightmare of an issue, but political parties won't touch it because it's a really good way to never get voted into office again, and you really can't run on entitlement reforms, which is the broad basket of what Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security. By the way, most of the federal budget actually goes to these systems, and it's basically baked into the cake, meaning trying to change it is nearly impossible. So when we have debates every year about budgets, it's really about a tiny percentage of the overall federal budget that we're actually debating, because these things are basically baked into the cake. And if you want to solve the problem of an increasingly large percentage of federal national debt to GDP and just the massive increases in interest rates that we're going to, the total interest payments that we're going to continue to see, you'd have to tackle entitlements, and yet no political party will touch it. So what do we do about that? I think that is one of the massive questions that we're going to be facing, especially with the collapse of the dollar as the world's reserve currency, which is a whole nother episode, which we all should be thinking about very long and hard right now, because that's also coming down the pipes. And the money that you have in retirement right now, the money that you have in the stock market, the cash that you think is sitting in a bank account is slowly being inflated away, and will continue to be inflated away unless something changes. And it seems unlikely something will change. And it also seems likely that that reserve currency status that the U.S. holds, which allows it to continue to print money and have essentially a monopoly to a certain extent on the money supply and the ability to inject liquidity into the markets, is going to change. This is an untenable long-term solution. So, back to Social Security. Again, it's a symptom, let's say, or at least it's a good heuristic for the broader problem at hand, which is the fact that we have a declining population. And the U.S., in some sense, has been able to withstand some of this because we're a country of immigrants. We have record numbers of immigrants coming into the country. And whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, it's simply a fact that that's helping to stave off the more dramatic effects of a declining population. That will change eventually. But for now, we have that benefit, at least in this regard. So what do you do when your entire economic system is built around these principles of growth? And how do you combat what inevitably will be a massive aging population with an ever-shrinking number of young people to take care of the old people? And it's a serious problem. We're going to have to figure out how to deal with it. I think there's a couple different potential solutions. One would be one that's being implemented insanely rapidly, which I harp on about all the time, which is AI. And essentially, we're going to get better at doing more with less. And one person is going to be worth 1.2, and then 1.5, and then 2.5, etc. And one interesting personal anecdote here that I think is useful is, so I run a landscaping company, and I was walking into a shop called Formula K the other day, and they have this autonomous mower sitting right at the front of the shop. And every time I go in there, I kind of joke with the guys, like, that thing scares me. And I mean, it does to a certain extent, but it's also inevitable. But there are some serious limitations with the device, which are somewhat relevant, but we don't need to get into at this time. But the idea behind it, at least, is solid. And the idea is that you could essentially have one operator be programming that unit to do, let's say, a soccer field, while the operator is on a separate unit getting all the areas that it isn't capable of getting, that are tricky to get, that need the operator to actually do the service. But the idea is you could have one operator operate two mowers. And it goes to this idea of doing more with less. If you're going to have a declining population and you're going to have a smaller share of young people having to do more things, you're going to have to automate more things, and you're going to have to make things more efficient. And what is capitalism really, really damn good at doing? It's that, if anything. And along with, decreasing mortality rates and increasing standards of living and effectively living in a utopia compared to all of history. So we have some things to be grateful for with capitalism. That's for damn sure. So we're going to have to continue to do this. And again, I'm not trying to paint a doom and gloom perspective, but this is one of those issues that people just don't think about. You don't think, oh man, we're running out of people. That's not, you haven't heard that before. Not really. It's really only in, I would say, the last 5 years that I've even begun to read articles about this subject, and those have been pretty few and far between, shall we say. But let's get to some of the potential benefits here. So not benefits, solutions. So, what do you do here exactly? So we have about 50% of women at the age of 30 will not be able to have kids. What do you do with that? How do you re-engineer society to avoid that problem? Because again, the optimistic side of this is that 80% of those women that don't have kids actually wanted to have kids, which is actually rather critical because that means that they want to solve this problem. So how do you encourage, how do you re-engineer, what steps could you take in a practical manner to encourage women to have families, but more specifically, have families sooner? Well, what is the number one problem that women are trying to solve in this 20 to 30 year time span. Well, it's how do you balance having a successful career and having a family? And it's extremely difficult. But one thing that we could do is we could carve out a period of time while in the educational and career path process that we designate as a society as like, look, we're going to do everything we can to incentivize, to work around, to carve out this period of time as helping to enable women to have a family, find a significant other, engage and start that process at a young age when it's actually viable, but then also be able to pursue a career later in life, be able to do both essentially. And one of the problems with our current model is that corporations don't want women to do both at the same time. They want women to work 40, 50, 60-hour weeks. It's nearly impossible to raise a family and work 40, 50, 60-hour weeks. So you have an incentive structure from a capitalistic society saying, no, we want you to work and we want you to work hard, and you need to go to college, and then after college you're going to need to get an internship and a job, and then you're going to have to pursue your career, and then we'll worry about the family thing later, which in theory sounds reasonable. The problem is that if we wait too long, if women wait too long, they literally can't have a family. So then how as a society do we re-engineer this value structure towards family? And one of the solutions that Shaw mentioned and that I think is reasonable is this idea of carving out this period of time, of saying as a society, we value this, we value mothers, we're going to shift around our perspective on careers and shift around our perspective on education and carve out periods of time and help to encourage and incentivize women to actually start a family early and then also pursue a career. Because if we don't, we're going to end up with the 80% of mothers that wish that they did have kids. Or 80% of couples, women that wish they could be mothers and that couldn't. And that's something that we want to avoid at all costs. So, I think that will do for an overview of this topic. Paul Ehrlich is wrong. We're not going to have a population bomb. In fact, the opposite is occurring. Population collapse is a real existential threat. People are not talking about it enough. Most people that don't end up having kids don't have kids because it's a choice, but rather it's because they couldn't. And that's one of the key reasons here to remember is that people want this. And that's the first step here, is to recognize that people do. So then how do we rearrange things so that they're able to actually have a family? That'll do it for this one. I want to talk about a number of the other micro issues here. I mean, this is the broad one, but there's a number of interesting micro issues at play here too. But I'm running out of brain, and it's been a long day, so thank you for listening, the three of you that made it this far, and we'll see you on the next one.